I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Linda Zayas Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Hello, everybody. Welcome to GM Tools Thinking in 3 Dimensions.
And thank you for the gift sub number.
That's right. So today we're going to be talking about the kind of things you need to consider when you're moving from a 2-dimensional game into 3 dimensions. That's usually going to be the case because things are flying or climbing around, but it could be because you're in an underwater situation where everything is always in 3 dimensions.
Mm-hmm. Or it could be because you are in a room that has multiple open levels, like high cliffs or canyons.
That's right, or just like a room where you can climb upstairs and be overlooking the previous floor of the room, sometimes created in castles for defense, where you could stack the archers up in the higher floor and they could just shoot down, and then everybody would have to get through your armored and shielded knights to get to the stairs in the back of the room that they could take up to get to the archers who were killing them while they were doing that. So there's numerous reasons that you might wind up with multiple floors, I guess, without literally climbing or flying, but they're most likely to come up when somebody is just like always climbing or flying because they have a climb speed or they have a fly speed or overland heightened flight magic that lasts for a really long time. Airwalk is going to do it for some encounters, but it's not enough for them to really be default, just like I'm always in the air.
Yeah.
But anytime you're going underwater, you instantly have to deal with this. And so there was a little bit of information about dealing with thinking in 3 dimensions and the aquatic adventures for Pathfinder 1st Edition because, well, their adventures are aquatic. That means it's got the water all the time. So
adventures are aquatic. That means it's got the water all the time. Ageless wisdom.
Yes, ageless wisdom. Think about how much you learned today. They got the water all the time. So,
Rico disapproves.
Or maybe he just slashes it. Scribbling notes furiously. Alright, so, when you're playing in 2 dimensions, whether it's with a grid or with Theater of the Mind, there's a lot less to keep track of because of the fact that characters can be moving, especially if the room is like a narrow corridor or doesn't have a lot to it in one of the 2 dimensions, which can often be the case, then it's pretty easy. You're just moving like towards certain monsters, maybe around them a little bit, and in bigger areas there's a little bit more depth to the fight. But in 3-dimensional combat, in 3-dimensional games, there's more representation than you can do on a flat battle map.
Yeah.
And there's also just constantly more positioning, even in a narrow hallway, and especially in an open area, because people are going up and over. You can't just say, oh, well, this person can be surrounded by at most 8 people, because that's how many squares are around the bottom of their space. There's a lot more that you have to think about.
Well, I mean, you have sort of the person, I think the person standing on the ground, and then you have flying that is able to go over top it, does have still some notable differences from when you're in the water.
What about everyone's flying?
And then everyone's flying,
That's sort of similar to when you're in the water.
When everyone's flying, Because the issue where, like, because if you just have the flat and then the over top, then you still, when you're considering tactical positioning like flanking and things like that, you've only still got that flat area to think about for that, because the upper sections don't have their flank ability really. Right. Whereas once you get fully 3-dimensional, then
you can be flanking from above and below.
You can be flanking from above and below and diagonally and sideways, and there's pretty much there's pretty much like, unless you have a narrow doorway, there's no blocking people from moving around freely.
That's right. It's very hard to block people in 3 dimensions. Um, so one of the we often play with theater of the mind, but when you are playing with a grid, you wind up having to think about how you're going to represent the third dimension. A standard hack is to potentially use a die that you just flip to how many 5-foot spaces a character is above the ground of the battle mat. So, for instance, if the die was on 5, that would mean they were 25 feet up. Doesn't necessarily work if everything is massively off the ground, more than 100 feet, because even your d20 is not enough at that point.
And for a water situation, you could do it in the reverse, where the surface of the water is the 0 point, and then the dice are measuring how far below the surface they are.
Or above the bed.
Or above the bed, yeah.
Either
Depending
way.
on how I'm thinking of encounters in deep water where you're just kind of near the surface. Like if you're doing an encounter in a pirate themed campaign, hypothetically.
Right. And however, whether or not you're tracking how high or low they are, sometimes a creature is going to move directly above or below another creature. And if you move directly above or below another creature, you're going to need some way to show that on the map. One interesting hack is those little pizza dividers that they put in the center of a pizza. The little plastic things are like just about tall enough that you could stick a mini under them, and they're pretty stable, so you can stick one of those, put the one that's higher up on top of that.
Also, those sort of standard Chessex, like, dice set boxes with the clear bottom can easily fit. If you turn them upside down, you pop them over the mini, and then you have a platform to stick another mini on top of. There's also a wide variety of combat tier type products out there that if you're looking for more specificity, that have like actual elevated grids so you can do more complex things.
That's right. Steven Glicker says, I have it that the PCs are in the 5 foot, so 10 feet away is one space above a PC. So all PCs are basically 5 feet off the ground. So I think he's talking about the fact that because characters have height, that means that the space that is above you is essentially the space that goes up to the 10-foot mark. So
Yes.
that means that if you have a room that's 10 feet tall, you could still reach a character that is going as high as they can,
Yes.
even without a reach weapon. And if you have a room that's 15 feet tall, which we recently had in our Iron Fang Invasion game, lots of caverns that were exactly 15 feet tall, then your reach weapon can hit, say, Morlocks that are climbing all the way to the top of the ceiling as high as they can go. And so, basically, you have to remember that when you're working in 3D, that like something that is in the space that goes up to that 10-foot high ceiling is actually still adjacent to your characters, because you actually are 3-dimensional even when you're not flying. You have some height to you.
Another thing that you can do on a battle map, if the fight is taking place in areas if the fight is then taking place in areas that are very divided apart, you may even be able to use like one map and another map, and then just sort of and there's 400 feet in between these two fights, sort of thing going on. I had or somewhat abstract that distance, and then be like, okay, yeah, it's going to take you one turn to move, or say 3 actions to move from this section to this section, rather than fully speccing that sort of thing out.
And yeah, you could also, if you have multiple floors that are a different setup, try to make it obvious which floor corresponds to which other floor, but put them on different maps. And then when someone goes up, like, transfer them to that part of the higher up map where the other floor is, like, say, a lot higher up then.
Yeah.
Especially if there's, like, different features that you have to draw on, and it would be super confusing to try to draw it all onto one superimposed map in different colors or with dotted lines. So there's a lot of different ways you can visualize it. You could also just try to do it with theater of the mind, but if so, a lot of the usual tricks to abstract theater of the mind are a lot harder in 3 dimensions because they rely on the fact that I mean there's theater of the mind where you just don't care and you make it up, but theater of the mind that our group usually does, we're pretty close to being accurate with where people are positioned. We don't fuss exactly 5 feet because nobody can memorize in their head a theater of the mind of that, but it's pretty close, and you do that using geometric tricks. But with 3 dimensions, it's a lot harder to pull that off consistently unless you have a very good sense, or say it's that 15-foot high cavern where it's a pretty constrained 3 dimensions, and there's not something really different going on with the upper dimension. It's just like, oh yeah, of course, the Morlocks are always as high as they can be unless they've come down to attack us.
One thing that can help is assuming that people are always at some easier to remember distance numbers. So if somebody has a weapon, if an enemy comes in and attacks the PCs and their weapon has a 60-foot range increment, then like saying, oh, they're 60 feet away.
Yep.
So then you have like some memorable number that's easy to deal with, rather than just saying, oh, these are going to be 70 and that one's 75 or whatever.
Right. So it's possible to just completely do it with theater of the mind and stay reasonably accurate, but it starts using more and more mental processing. There's also another thing you have to think about, whether you're using theater of the mind or on a battle map, which is ranges of, like Linda was talking about, ranges of spells, ranges of range increments for weapons. That's because of the fact that our old friend Pythagoras is going to rear his head here. When something's in the air and also has some distance away from you on the ground, then you need the Pythagorean theorem potentially to figure out exactly how far away it is. You could also, in theory, use the sort of abstraction of 5'10", 5'10", 5'10", and then draw the diagonal into the air.
Line up into the air,
but that seems really hard. So instead, it's easier to just use the Pythagorean theorem and estimate. If you don't want to do that, then basically it's about 1.5 times if they are up the same amount that they are over, and it gets closer and closer to just being only a little bit more than the longer of the two sides, the less equal they are. So just whatever you do, don't think that they're 100 feet away if they are 50 over and 50 up, because that's really, really off. And it's going to throw your ranges out of whack when they turn out to be able to move very, very quickly from the supposed 100 feet away.
Another thing to consider for 3D mobility is the ability to fall.
Yep. The Gravity Express.
The Gravity Express, yes, which definitely makes distances seem sometimes shorter than they appear. You fly over and then you drop. And that does mean that, and also the consideration that oftentimes going up is a lot harder than going down.
Joe points out Pythagorean theorem is easier to deal with if you divide out the 5 feet for the squares before you calculate the Pythagorean theorem. That's definitely true, because 20 feet, say, is 4 squares, and 15 feet is 3 squares, so you would know that it's a 3, 4, 5 triangle, and it's going to be 25 feet along the diagonal. And it's just a little easier to square things and then subtract them out if you are doing it in squares and not in 75 squared and 85 squared.
Yeah.
Alright. So, we talked about placing things on the map, and we've also talked about doing 3 dimensions without a map, calculating distances using the Pythagorean theorem, and some little hacks you can use to show that a character is higher above multiple overlaid maps, just putting elevation markers on it. Is there anything else that that you think we're missing from the standard thinking in 3D toolkit?
Well, I want to talk about underwater more specifically
All
because
right.
underwater has some of its own challenges from that 3D perspective, in terms of both positioning and also mobility.
All right. So, what would you say is the big difference in positioning for underwater compared to flying?
Well, I think that it's a matter of well, with flying you can when you're looking at underwater versus flying and the sorts of speed, I think it's a matter of what kind of speeds you're usually dealing with, because flying you're a lot more likely to be having to deal with much longer distances. With underwater combat, you're dealing with much shorter distances, and you're also dealing with the fact that people are going to have to be swimming to. I guess with flying, you do have
They have to take the fly action or they're gonna fall.
Yeah. I guess it is more parallel in second edition now. Now that I'm thinking through it as I talk.
Mm-hmm.
But but also like when you have, I was thinking about when you have people who flying, you pretty much either have to have wings or you have to have magic. Where swimming is something that someone might be a situation that they're thrown into that they do not then have something that is helping them be good at.
Mm. You mean like just do the athletics check of swim? Whoops, you have to do it. Whereas when you're flying, you opt in by casting fly or something like that.
Yeah. And there's also the issue of and I guess then the issue of sinking is sort of parallel to the issue of falling when flying.
There is the issue of breath, but that's not really about thinking in 3D.
No,
that's more about its own thing. Yes, Ultra, you could just be falling with style.
Falling with style.
That's right.
Falling damage.
Buzz Lightyear.
To infinity and beyond.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to check, are there any questions from chat about thinking in 3D? I see a suggestion to use a Rubik's Cube for multiple levels.
Uh-huh. You can be thrown. Alright, it looks like I'm not seeing any particular additional questions. I think we may have covered the topic. It's a little bit of a shorter topic. Some of the ones that we've had on the show are like these broad topics that are like, wow, you can't even possibly cover everything about like themes.
Here's one.
Oh, here's one.
How do you limit the depth of the battlefield? So if you are in a place where a natural depth limiter exists, such as a cavern or a ceiling, or a body of water, then you have something to throw over the top. So I have in some situations dealt with this actually came up when working on a Pathfinder Society scenario, the Rasping Rebirth, where it was like, well, I don't just want the PCs to be able to fly up really high and just kite down at their opponent, but so there needs to be like some kind of a thing over the top. In that case, it was in an area where it made sense to have there's this swarm cover that's up over the top that's dangerous when you go up there. You could have flowing streams of air or other things like that if that makes sense. Another thing,
I think Joe's question is a little bit different. When he said limit, it looks like he's talking about this situation. So your characters have gone 1,500 feet down in the water.
Yeah.
But the depth of this water is still thousands and thousands of feet to the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
And they're nowhere near the surface. They're nowhere near the bed. And they're attacked by a bunch of Sahuagin.
Mm-hmm.
Limit, and then I think he's asking, how do you limit, as in set a frame of reference, or even just like, what's to stop one PC and Sahuagin from going really, really up, hundreds and hundreds of feet away from everyone else, and others going really down, really, really down, and all away from each other.
I would say generally when you have the combat happen, put something there that can exist as a frame of reference. For water, at least, you can have like there's this, even if it's like, oh, there's this piece of garbage that's floating here, or like there's a school of fish that's just kind of, or like there's a, well, I mean, the school of fish would probably move too, but like, oh, there's an old anchor, or there's this old ship that's
There's
here.
an anchor that's just floating in the middle of the sea and didn't go all the way down.
I'm sorry, I'm now thinking about the seafloor, I realize, for these.
Yep.
But I would say then, if there's not like a logical object to have because it would have either sunk or floated or whatever, having the opponents stay like relatively static in their elevation.
The PCs are the ones who are changing the elevation, and the opponents won't get kited if they do that.
Well, that if the PCs are changing the elevation, yeah. What you can do is you can have sort of a 0 point set based on where the enemies start, and then you can go above and below that.
Maybe there's a way to make it a little more to build off of that. Perhaps the Sahuagin can come in on like a riptide that carries them really fast to the PCs, and it's at that elevation.
Yeah.
So then you're like, okay, 0 is the riptide, and Sebastian talked about the currents that this plane of water has. Is a similar situation. 0 is the riptide, and you can be above or below that. That's where they came in. Zathos wonders how Starfinder spaceship combats deal with this. The answer is, by not being three-dimensional, just sort of going around on a hex grid and dealing with the abstraction mostly.
Yeah. Yeah, and then with since you're going to be going above and below, just using like either different colored dice to mark the these are people who are above and these are people who are below. It could even be like, oh yeah, I'm going to use blue dice for above and red dice for below, or having some kind of other marker, like I'm going to put a penny next to the dice that represent people who are sinking.
Right.
I haven't actually done a lot of 3D combat on grids. So I had to think about that. But yeah, that's a really good question.
I think we've definitely done a lot of flying on grids in org play tables, but not a lot of water. Especially not that deep.
Usually, yeah, exactly. And then with flying, there's not that much combat that takes place that's so far off the ground that you don't have that.
And even then, you have the ground.
Reference. That's why I said that's so far off the ground you wouldn't have the ground height as an easy
right.
reference. We have a question here about the intricacies of cover in 3D.
Yes.
Oh, that's a good one.
Well, fortunately, cover is like a little easier to deal with in second edition. That it doesn't have like use the corner except when you use the center. It's just cover is the ruling is in the second edition core rulebook. Usually, it says basically as the GM you'll be able to tell when something has cover because it looks like it does. But if you need to calculate it because you're not sure, go from the center of one space to the center of another space. And that's still how you would do it in 3 dimensions. You just need to draw the center like up and diagonal up rather than straight as a line across.
I'd recommend probably considering it as like a lot of cover. Is it cover that is like they're inside of a building, it blocks from all directions, or is it cover like it's a wall? And if it's cover like it's a wall, just for ease, I would probably say, like, well, unless you're directly above or basically above, then the wall is going to protect you.
Let's see. Sebastian says, if there's a climbed wall where you get attacked during the climb, you might want a map for the vertical alignment of the character moving up and down the wall. Yeah, you potentially could do that as well.
Yeah.
With sort of a side view. Rico says, do you place all your miniatures so they're standing arrayed like Star Trek starships in Starship Combat, where they're on one plane facing the same way, or do you array them haphazardly because up and down are valid facings? Well,
that's a question for Zathos.
Yeah, so. I don't know how Zathos does it.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say Star Trek is pretty cool. So you could do it like Star Trek and just forget about the fact that all those dimensions exist. It just depends on what you want to do.
Well, I mean, I can see why Starfinder went with the 2D Starship Combat, just because 3D is a lot more complicated to deal with, and it's not something that I would say that 3D combat is generally something to be used more sparingly because it's more taxing for both the GM and the players to run and to consider what's going on. But it is also like a really interesting spice to throw into your game.
It is something to be used more sparingly, but once PCs have high level abilities to constantly be flying, you don't get to pick.
Yes, that's true. 3D combat, and I guess this is another consideration because I mentioned kiting. But it's also something to think about as a GM to, when you know your players are going to be bringing the combat into the 3D space, to make sure that the opponents you're throwing at them can at least almost all of them respond to the fact that the PCs are fighting in 3D space. So once you get to the mid-high levels, if your PCs can, if the space allows the PCs to just fly overhead and pelt ranged attacks down at the NPC and the NPC can't respond to that, then, you know, that's fun occasionally, but that's not really going to be an encounter design that provides challenge and variety to the characters. So looking at more enclosed spaces as well when you have enemies that logically like wouldn't really have a ranged attack or flight capacity, looking at putting them in enclosed spaces and then reserving encounters in big open spaces for things that do have an ability to fly, to make ranged attacks, to make attacks that might entangle or restrict the movement of the PCs, so that you don't have these sort of one-sided, oh look, I found the loophole and I'm just gonna push the button until they die.
There's a reason all of the constant flight like items and abilities are really high level in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, as opposed to the first level rock animal companion in Pathfinder 1st Edition, where you just win the entire adventure on the rock shooting down arrows at people. So if your players want to get constant flight at lower levels, you should probably not give it to them unless you're ready to change every encounter so that they're primarily ranged capacity and don't have a bunch of melee that are just going to be kited to death. Sebastian is happy about that change.
And speed is all the more important in 3 dimensions too, because since you can move so much more freely, a lot of the techniques that people might use to try to bottleneck or stop opponents in 2D aren't going to work. So that
Rico
also
says
means
if
that
your players want a thing, don't give it to them. That's right. No. As you've seen from other episodes, you usually want to talk to your players and work things out, but flying is just something that as we said in this episode, is a sometimes snack. It's a mental stress for everybody, and it can lead to degenerate problems. So that's one of the things that you shouldn't probably give to your players unless you're ready to have that mental stress all the time and change all the encounters and you're not running a published adventure. There you go. Zeta says that you need a 3D graphics loaded set of software to do the calculations to the table. Yeah, in 2nd edition, you can get flying at level 7 from, but it's going to be pretty special at level 7.
And Sebastian says the fact that monsters and PCs have to spend an action to fly that turns into an actual tactical choice before you would usually always want to be flying.
Right, because you could kite everything more, and even if they could get up to you, they still had to spend actions to get up there unless they were also always flying, and it became that game of, well, then of course we're all always flying.
Dispel magic.
Always fun. People underestimate the value of dispel magic, but if you give someone like a rock companion that they can fly on, for instance, then dispel magic won't help. Earthbind can help get something onto the ground, but always have a trinket. Rico says monsters like Drake sometimes just use their flying as a big hop to get from PC to PC. Yeah, if the monsters are melee, then ultimately their flying means that they're going to have to come down to the PCs anyway. Yeah. But it's ranged flying creatures that can really kite things out.
Well, we had a meme in the first long-term campaign that I was ever in, the level where our group just did not have range capacity. So we're like these powerful 14th level characters, and like our nightmare was a level 6 archer that flies, because we determined that a level 6 archer in an open field, a level 6 archer who had flying ability could kill our entire 14th level party, and there was nothing we could do about it.
That's correct. It involved, they had to have a certain amount of movement speed.
Mm-hmm.
Or no, just stay at a certain altitude.
Had to stay at a
because
certain altitude.
The party had a lot of scions,
Mm-hmm.
and they are or characters with psionics, which are known for shorter ranges and very variable and powerful abilities. So the level 6 archer would stay outside of the range of medium range. The scions had no long range attacks that they could use. And then also nobody in the party had themselves had archery of pretty much any kind. And so the level 6 flying archer would probably just kill the entire party.
So this isn't just an excuse to make a reference to an old game meme. It's also a consideration as a GM with the types of encounters that you throw at your PCs. Think about when you're putting in enemies, particularly 3D has a lot more opportunities for the opponent's high mobility, because mobility is more important in 3D, to just completely stymie the players, and that can be really frustrating. So make sure that the opponents don't have an advantage in positioning and mobility that is going to be insurmountable for your PCs. If you're giving the opponents these sorts of things, make sure the PCs have some way to respond. So a lot of groups, make sure they've got range attacks, make sure the opponent can't just completely outrun them, or that if the opponent does have a strong mobility advantage, that they have some reason to engage with the PCs, whether that's they've got some kind of short range attack that they want to do, they have some kind of melee attack that they want to do, they really want to take something that the PCs, they really want to stick it to the PCs. They want to take something that the PCs have, but they know that the PCs are just going to chase them down to their lair unless they defeat all of them, that kind of thing.
Alright. Zatha says Fireball. Fireball is a great long-range spell that the party did not have.
Yes.
They did not have anyone who could cast Fireball. So the level 6 archer was safe from that. The hypothetical level 6 archer. Alright. So I think we covered a lot about 3D. So why don't we say goodbye to YouTube and then figure out what's going on with, talk about upcoming episodes again for
Sounds
a quick
good.
bit and see what's going on with the poll. Bye, YouTube. See you next time.
Bye!